December 7th, 1941, 50 a.m. The deck of the USS West Virginia Battleship Row, Pearl Harbor bound. The tropical morning air is shattered not by a whistle, but by the low-frequency thrum of 97 Nakajima B-5N2 Kate torpedo bombers descending like vultures. On the bridge of the WWII, as her crew affectionately calls the 33,000-ton Titan, the world turns into a kaleidoscope of oil-slicked water and jagged steel. A Type 91 torpedo streaks through the harbor, its wake a white scar on the blue surface, before slamming into the port side. The impact is a dull, subterranean thud that lifts the massive ship as if she were a toy. Within minutes, 6 more torpedoes rip into the hull. The West Virginia is being disemboweled. High above, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida looks down through the canopy of his lead aircraft. He watches the WWII groan and settle. He sees the USS California take 2 torpedoes, her dark gray hull listing as the muddy bottom of the harbor reaches up to claim her. To Fuchida and the pilots of the Kido Butai, the scene is one of definitive terminal destruction. This isn't just a tactical victory, it is the execution of a navy. As the West Virginia sinks into the oily silt, her decks awash and her superstructure a twisted forest of fire, the Japanese pilots radio back a message that would define Imperial strategy for the next 3 years. The American battleship force has ceased to exist. By 10:30 a.m., the WWII is on the bottom, her hull resting in 40 feet of water, her port side torn open by a hole large enough to drive a truck through. Next to her, the California is submerged up to her main deck. The USS Nevada is beached and burning. To any rational observer, these ships are no longer instruments of war. They are steel coffins, monuments to a lost era of naval surface dominance. The Japanese High Command calculates the mathematics of industrial recovery and concludes that even if the Americans could find the steel to build new ships, these specific vessels, the backbone of the Pacific Fleet, are gone forever. They belong to the mud of Oahu now. But as the smoke clears, a different kind of war begins. It is a war fought by men in canvas, diving suits, and engineers with slide rules. While the Japanese celebrate in Tokyo, believing they have gained a 10-year window of supremacy, the Americans are already looking at the mud of Pearl Harbor, not as a graveyard, but as a mine. Under the surface of the harbor, in a world of zero visibility and suffocating pressure, Navy divers begin a task that every naval architect in the world had deemed impossible. The West Virginia isn't just sunk, she is filled with 2,500 tons of mud and 500,000 gallons of fuel oil. Her hull is a maze of jagged, razor-sharp steel. But the order from Admiral Chester W. Nimitz is absolute. Get them up. The salvage of the Ghost Fleet becomes the greatest engineering feat in maritime history. Using massive timber cofferdams, temporary watertight enclosures bolted directly to the sunken hulls, the engineers begin to pump out the Pacific Ocean. It is a grueling, inch-by-inch process. On the California, workers have to patch hundreds of manholes and vents while submerged in a toxic cocktail of seawater and rotted rations. On the West Virginia, the damage is so extensive that divers have to sew the hull back together underwater using specialized steel plates before the ship can even think about floating. By early 1942, as the Japanese sun rises over Singapore and the Philippines, the dead ships begin to stir. On the morning of May 17th, the West Virginia is finally refloated. She looks like a derelict, charred, rusted, and weeping oil, but she is buoyant. As she is towed into dry dock number 1, the same dock where the USS Pennsylvania sat during the attack, the workers stand in silence. They are looking at a ghost. But the Americans aren't just fixing these ships. They are transforming them. The old Navy that died on December 7th featured birdcage masts, primitive fire control, and thin anti-aircraft protection. The ships that will emerge from the yards will be something entirely different. They are being rebuilt with blisters, massive bulges along the waterline to absorb torpedo hits, and their decks are being cleared to make room for a forest of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons. Most importantly, they are being fitted with the Mark 8 Big Eye radar, a technology that will allow them to see through darkness, smoke, and distance with a precision the Japanese cannot even imagine. While the Japanese Navy prepares for a decisive surface engagement in the tradition of the samurai, eye to eye, blade to blade, The Ghost Fleet is being reborn as a collection of high-tech, radar-guided executioners. The mud of Pearl Harbor had hidden them for a year, but the Pacific is about to find out that a ghost with a 16-inch gun is a very dangerous thing. Late 1943. Puget Sound Navy Yard, Washington. The air is thick with the smell of ozone and burnt paint. Thousands of welders, many of them women who a year ago were waitresses or school teachers, crawl through the steel ribs of the USS West Virginia. If a Japanese spy were to stand on the pier, he wouldn't recognize the ship. The WWII has been literally split open and widened. Her old cage masts, relics of the First World War, have been chopped away, replaced by sleek, modern towers bristling with radar arrays. This is not a repair job. It is a reincarnation. While the Imperial Japanese Navy continues to train its crews for the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle fought with visual optics and night-fighting bravery, the Americans are building a digital battlefield. Inside the armored bowels of the rebuilt USS California and USS Tennessee technicians install the Combat Information Center. This is the ship's new brain. It aggregates data from the SK air search radar and the Mark 8 fire control radar, allowing the Ghost Fleet to see targets through a typhoon, through a smoke screen, or in the pitch black of a tropical night. By mid-1944, the Ghosts are ready. They sail out of the West Coast shipyards, their hulls painted in jagged dazzle camouflage. To the men on board, many of whom were survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack, the journey back across the Pacific is a pilgrimage of vengeance. They aren't the fast, sleek carriers that stole the headlines at Midway. They are the old heavies, slow, ponderous, but carrying the most terrifying, concentrated firepower on Earth. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence is failing. Their reconnaissance pilots report sightings of new American battleships, but the Imperial High Command remains skeptical. Their records are clear. The West Virginia, the USS Maryland, the Tennessee, the California, and the USS Pennsylvania were all neutralized at Pearl Harbor. They believe the Americans are using psychological warfare, renaming new ships to confuse them. They cannot conceive of a world where a ship that was 80% submerged and burned to a shell could be back in the line of battle. October 24, 1944. The Surigao Strait, Philippines. The stage is set for the greatest I told you so in military history. The Japanese, desperate to stop the American invasion of Leyte, launch Operation Shogo. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura leads the Southern Force, centered around the battleships Japanese battleship Yamashiro and Japanese battleship Fuso. He is a traditionalist, a man who believes in the long lance torpedo and the superior night fighting skills of the Japanese sailor. He is steaming into a narrow corridor of water, unaware that he is heading into a trap designed at Fort Sill and forged in the mud of Hawaii. Waiting for him at the end of the strait is Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf, and he has brought the Ghosts with him. 6 American battleships form a line across the exit of the strait. 5 of them, the West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, were at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. They are crossing the T, the ultimate tactical maneuver, where the entire broadside of a fleet is brought to bear on the approaching head of an enemy column. On the bridge of the West Virginia, the radar screen shows a green blip at 30,000 yards. The Japanese cannot see the Americans. They are blind, searching the horizon with binoculars. But on the WWII, the radar-controlled computers are already calculating the solution. The 16-inch guns, the very ones that were silent and half-submerged 3 years ago, begin to rise. The range closes. 25,000 yards. 22,000 yards. On the Japanese ships, there is silence. On the American ships, there is only the hum of cooling fans and the quiet murmurs of radar operators. The Ghost Fleet doesn't need to see the enemy with eyes. They can feel their heartbeat through the electronics. At 3:53 a.m., Admiral Oldendorf gives the order that 3 years of salvage, sweat, and secret engineering had been leading to open fire. The darkness of the Surigao Strait doesn't just break, it disintegrates. When the USS West Virginia unleashes her first broadside, the pressure wave is so violent it blows the hats off the sailors on the open decks of nearby destroyers. 8 16-inch shells, each weighing as much as a Volkswagen Beetle, scream into the sky. They travel in a tight, glowing cluster, guided not by a human eye peering through a lens, but by pulses of electromagnetic energy bouncing off Japanese steel. On the Japanese flagship, Japanese battleship Yamamoto, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura is still trying to understand where the American destroyers are when the horizon suddenly ignites. There is no flash of an enemy muzzle he can see, only the arrival of the shells. The WWII's first salvo is a mathematical impossibility in the era of manual warfare. At a range of over 22,000 yards in total darkness, the first shells hit the Yamamoto directly on the bridge and superstructure. The Japanese battleship, a veteran of the Imperial Japanese Navy, is staggered. Then comes the USS California, then the USS Tennessee. For the Japanese sailors, the experience is supernatural. They are being struck by invisible giants. On the Yamamoto, the pagoda mast, the iconic symbol of Japanese naval power, becomes a chimney of fire. The American shells aren't just hitting, they are arriving with a rhythmic, mechanical cruelty. Because of the Mark 8 radar, the Ghost Fleet doesn't need to walk their fire onto the target. Every salvo is a straddle. Inside the USS Tennessee, the fire control men watch the radar pips. Every time the pips merge, they know another 1,000 pounds of high explosives have found a home. This is the revenge of the old heavies. The Tennessee fires 69 shells from her 14-inch guns in mere minutes. The West Virginia fires 93. They are pouring more steel into the Japanese column than was dropped on them during the entire morning of Pearl Harbor. Nishimura sends out a desperate final radio transmission. We are proceeding into the face of certain death. He doesn't realize he isn't fighting a living fleet. He is fighting the ghosts of December 7th. On the Japanese battleship Fuso, the situation is even more horrific. Hit by torpedoes and then hammered by the radar-guided ghosts, the massive ship capsizes and breaks in two. The two halves stay afloat for an hour, burning like funeral pyres in the middle of the Strait, a mirror image of what the Japanese had done to the USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma. As the sun begins to rise over the Philippines, the smoke clears to reveal a graveyard. The southern force of the Imperial Japanese Navy is gone. The Yamamoto is at the bottom. The Fuso is at the bottom. Only a handful of shattered destroyers remain to flee the scene. But the real shock comes later. When the Japanese survivors are plucked from the water, they ask their captors which new American battleships had done this. When they are told the names, West Virginia, California, Tennessee, the prisoners fall into a stunned, catatonic silence. They had been told these ships were mud. They had been told America was a nation of soft consumers who couldn't rebuild. Yet here were the very ships they killed, looking more modern, firing faster, and seeing through the dark better than anything in the Imperial arsenal. The Ghost Fleet had done more than win a battle at Surigao Strait. They had broken the Japanese spirit. They proved that you can sink a ship, you can burn a harbor, and you can scar a nation. The ships that began the war as victims in the mud of Hawaii ended it as the executioners of the Imperial Navy. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor didn't just haunt the Pacific. They conquered it.